Hello there, and welcome back to another quiet journey into the curious corners of our universe. Tonight, I have a question for you that might seem a bit strange at first. What if I told you that one of the colors you see every day doesn't actually exist? Not in the way that blue exists, or red, or even the gentle yellow of morning sunlight. This color is all around us. In flowers, in sunsets, in the screens we stare at before bed. You've probably worn it, painted with it, maybe even declared it your favorite color as a child. And yet, if you were to search for it in a rainbow, scan through the entire spectrum of light with the most sophisticated equipment we have, you wouldn't find it anywhere. It simply isn't there. The color I'm talking about is magenta. That vibrant, almost electric pink-purple that sits somewhere between red and violet in our minds, but nowhere in the actual spectrum of light. And tonight, we're going to explore why this impossible color exists in our perception, what it tells us about the remarkable machinery of our brains, and how something that isn't physically real can be so vividly, undeniably present in our experience of the world. But before we dive into this gentle mystery, where are you listening from tonight? Are you tucked under blankets? Perhaps with the soft glow of a screen that's probably displaying several colors that technically shouldn't exist. Or maybe you're taking a late evening walk, the sky painted in those impossible twilight hues that science says shouldn't be there but somehow are. I do hope this video helps you drift off into peaceful sleep, though I must warn you, once you learn about magenta's secret, you might start seeing the impossible everywhere you look. But don't worry, that's just your brain doing what it does best, creating reality from the raw materials of the universe, filling in gaps with such confidence that you'd never know anything was missing at all. So settle in, take a slow breath, and let's begin this journey into the space between spaces, the color between colors, and the remarkable story of how our brains became artists without ever asking our permission. To understand why magenta doesn't exist, we first need to understand what color actually is. And I don't mean this in a philosophical sense, though we could certainly spend hours pondering whether the red you see is the same red I see. No, I mean in the most fundamental physical sense, what is happening when we perceive color. Let's start with Sir Isaac Newton, who in 1666 was supposedly sitting in his room at Cambridge, avoiding the plague that was ravaging England. The story goes that he was playing with a prism, as one does during a pandemic, when he noticed something extraordinary. When sunlight passed through the triangular piece of glass, it split into a beautiful spectrum of colors: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. The rainbow that children memorize, that poets write about, that appears in the sky after rain. Newton had discovered something profound. White light wasn't pure and simple, as everyone had assumed. It was a mixture. A combination of all these different colors traveling together. The prism wasn't adding color to the light. It was revealing what was already there, hidden in the brightness. But here's where it gets interesting. Newton arranged these colors in a circle, the first color wheel, and he did something curious. He connected the red end of the spectrum to the violet end, creating a continuous loop. In doing so, he added colors that don't appear in the spectrum at all. The purples and magentas that bridge the gap between red and violet. Even Newton, the man who discovered the spectrum, knew that something was missing from the rainbow. Fast forward to 1801, and we meet Thomas Young, a polymath who spoke 13 languages and made contributions to everything from Egyptology to elasticity. Young proposed something radical. Light behaves like a wave. Different colors, he suggested, correspond to different wavelengths. Red light has the longest wavelength we can see, around 700 nanometers, while violet has the shortest, around 400 nanometers. Every other color falls somewhere in between. This was revolutionary, because it gave us a physical explanation for color. Blue isn't just blue. It's light with a wavelength of about 450 nanometers. Green is around 550 nanometers. Every color in the rainbow can be described by a single number, its wavelength. But wait, if every color has a wavelength, what wavelength is magenta? This is where our story takes a delicious turn into the impossible, because magenta doesn't have a wavelength. It can't. To understand why, imagine the spectrum of visible light laid out in front of you like a long ribbon, with red at one end and violet at the other. Every color in between represents a specific wavelength, a specific frequency of light wave. Orange is just a bit shorter than red, yellow shorter than orange, and so on, in a smooth progression. Now magenta appears to our eyes as a mixture of red and violet, the two ends of the spectrum, but in terms of wavelengths, red and violet are as far apart as two visible colors can be. There's no single wavelength that could be between them because the entire rest of the spectrum is between them. It would be like trying to find a number that's simultaneously larger than 10 and smaller than 1. The mathematics simply doesn't work. So if magenta doesn't exist as a wavelength of light, why do we see it? How can our eyes perceive something that isn't there? The answer lies not in the physics of light, but in the biology of vision. Our eyes don't actually see wavelengths directly. Instead, we have 3 types of color receptors in our retinas, called cones. One type is most sensitive to long wavelengths, what we call red, another to medium wavelengths, green, and the third to short wavelengths, blue. But here's the crucial part. These cones don't respond to just one specific wavelength. Their sensitivities overlap, creating a complex pattern of responses to different colors. When you see yellow light, for instance, it stimulates both your red and green cones. Your brain interprets this combination as yellow. When you see cyan, it's your green and blue cones firing together. Your brain has learned to translate these patterns of cone activation into the rich world of color you experience. But magenta? Magenta happens when your red and blue cones are stimulated without your green cones. In the natural spectrum, this never happens. Any wavelength that stimulates red or blue will also stimulate green to some degree because green is in the middle. The only way to achieve this pattern is to mix red light and blue light, to literally combine the two ends of the spectrum while skipping everything in between. When your brain receives this unusual signal, red cones firing, blue cones firing, but green cones quiet, it has to make sense of it somehow. It can't place this sensation anywhere on the spectrum from red to violet, because that entire spectrum is characterized by some level of green activation. So your brain does something remarkable. It invents a new color. It creates magenta, a color that exists purely as a product of neural processing, not as a property of light itself. Think about that for a moment. Your brain, faced with an impossible combination of signals, confidently produces a color that doesn't exist in nature's palette. It fills in the gap with such conviction that magenta seems as real as any other color. You can see it, point to it, remember it, even dream about it. And yet, in terms of the physics of light, it's a complete fabrication. But magenta isn't alone in its impossibility. There's an entire family of colors that exist only in our perception, not in the spectrum of light. And once you know about them, you'll start seeing them everywhere. Consider brown, for instance. You might think brown is just a dark orange or a muddy red, and in a sense you'd be right. But brown is actually one of the most complex colors your brain creates. There's no wavelength for brown. Instead, brown is what happens when your brain interprets orange or red light in the context of brighter surrounding colors. The exact same wavelengths that appear orange in one context will appear brown in another. Your brain is constantly adjusting, comparing, creating brown from the relationship between lights rather than from light itself. Or take pink. Not hot pink, or magenta pink, but soft, gentle pink. Pink is essentially light red, but there's no wavelength for light red any more than there's a wavelength for quiet blue or gentle green. Pink exists because your brain can imagine colors at different intensities, creating variations that physics never intended. But perhaps the strangest non-spectral colors are the ones we call impossible colors or forbidden colors. Colors that you shouldn't be able to see but sometimes can, under very specific circumstances. In 1983, researchers Hewitt Crane and Thomas Piantanida conducted an extraordinary experiment. They showed subjects adjacent fields of red and green light. but they used a special optical device to keep the boundary between the colors perfectly stable on the retina, even as the eye moved. Normally, your eyes make tiny movements called microsaccades, which prevent any one image from staying in exactly the same place on your retina for too long. This constant motion is why you don't usually see your blood vessels, even though they cast shadows on your retina. Your brain edits them out because they move with your eye. But when Crane and Piantanides stabilized that red-green boundary, something remarkable happened. Subjects reported that the border between the colors seemed to disappear, and in its place they saw colors they couldn't describe, colors that seemed to be simultaneously red and green. Not a mixture like brown or yellow, but actually both red and green at the same time. These impossible colors, sometimes called reddish-green or yellowish-blue, reveal something profound about how our vision works. We don't see colors, we construct them, and the rules of that construction can be bent, sometimes revealing colors that exist nowhere but in the delicate interplay of neurons in our visual cortex. This brings us to a fascinating question. If colors like magenta don't exist in the physical world, what else are we seeing that isn't really there? The answer, it turns out, is quite a lot. Your brain is constantly filling in gaps in your perception, creating a seamless experience from incomplete information. You have a blind spot in each eye, where the optic nerve connects to the retina, but you never notice it because your brain fills it in with what it expects to be there. The sharp, detailed vision you think you have across your entire visual field, that's an illusion too. Only a tiny portion of your retina, the fovea, can see in high detail. Everything else is peripheral vision, blurry and indistinct, but your brain creates the impression of clarity by rapidly moving your eyes and stitching together a complete picture. Color vision is perhaps the most elegant example of this creative process. The wavelengths of light entering your eyes are just the starting point. Your brain takes this raw data and transforms it into something far richer and more useful than mere wavelength detection could provide. Consider color constancy, the remarkable ability to perceive colors as stable despite dramatic changes in lighting. A white sheet of paper looks white to you whether you view it under the yellow light of an incandescent bulb, the blue light of the sky, or the green light filtered through leaves. The wavelengths reflecting off that paper are completely different in each case, yet your brain compensates, adjusting its interpretation so that white stays white. This isn't a bug in the system, it's a feature. If we saw only the raw wavelengths of light, the world would be a confusing, constantly shifting chaos of colors. That red apple would appear black in blue light, gray in dim light, orange in candlelight. Instead, your brain performs incredibly complex calculations, completely unconsciously, to extract the true color of objects, regardless of the lighting conditions. The story of how we discovered that magenta doesn't exist is really the story of how we came to understand vision itself, and like many scientific discoveries, it began with a puzzle that seemed to have nothing to do with color at all. In the early 1800s, scientists were trying to understand why the sky is blue. Lord Rayleigh would eventually explain it through the scattering of light. But in the process of investigating this question, researchers began to realize that human color perception was far more complex than anyone had imagined. The key breakthrough came from Hermann von Helmholtz, the German polymath, who seemed to have his fingers in every scientific pie of the 19th century. Helmholtz proposed what became known as the trichromatic theory of vision, the idea that we have three types of color receptors. This was revolutionary, because it suggested that all the millions of colors we can perceive are constructed from just three basic signals. But Helmholtz had a rival, Ewald Hering, who pointed out some problems with the three-receptor theory. Why? Hering asked. Do we never see reddish-green or yellowish-blue? Why do some colors seem to be opposites? And why do after images, those ghostly colors you see after staring at something bright, always appear in complementary colors? Hering proposed the opponent process theory that our visual system processes colors in opposing pairs, red versus green, blue versus yellow, black versus white. When you stare at a red image and then look at a white wall, you see a green afterimage because your red-green system has been fatigued in one direction and rebounds in the other. For decades, these two theories seemed incompatible. The trichromats had evidence from the physiology of the eye. The opponent process advocates had evidence from the psychology of perception. It wasn't until the 1970s that researchers realized both were right. They were just describing different stages of visual processing. Your eyes do indeed have three types of cones, as Helmholtz proposed, but the signals from these cones are processed by the brain in opponent pairs, as Herring suggested. It's a two-stage process, detection then interpretation, and it's in that second stage, the interpretation, that Magenta is born. This discovery opened up a new understanding of consciousness itself. If our brains can create colors that don't exist, what else might they be creating? This question became particularly pointed with the discovery of tetrachromats, people with 4 types of color receptors instead of the usual 3. The story of tetrachromacy begins with color blindness. Most colorblind men have a mutation in one of their cone types, typically the one sensitive to green light. The gene for this cone sits on the X chromosome, which is why colorblindness is more common in men. They have only one X chromosome, so one faulty gene causes colorblindness. Women have 2 X chromosomes, so they'd need the mutation on both to be colorblind. But here's where it gets interesting. Some women have one normal X chromosome and one with the colorblindness mutation. In most of their cone cells, one X chromosome is randomly deactivated, so some cones have the normal version and others have the mutated version. If the mutation shifts the sensitivity of the cone rather than eliminating it entirely, these women end up with 4 different types of color receptors instead of 3. In theory, these tetrachromat women should be able to see millions of colors that the rest of us can't perceive. Where we see a single shade of red, they might see 2 or 3 distinct colors. The magenta that doesn't exist for us might be just one of countless impossible colors visible to them. Finding true tetrachromats has proven challenging, partly because we don't have words for colors the rest of us can't see. How do you describe a color that exists beyond the normal human experience? Artist Concetta Antico, who has been identified as a possible tetrachromat, describes seeing colors in the shadow that others miss, purples in what appears gray to most people, oranges where others see only brown. But even for those of us with ordinary trichromatic vision, the world of impossible colors extends far beyond magenta. There's a whole category called chimerical colors, colors that can only be seen through visual fatigue or special optical conditions. If you stare at a bright cyan image for 30 seconds and then look at white paper, you'll see an orange afterimage. But if you stare at cyan and then look at orange, something strange happens. The afterimage and the real color combine in your perception to create a super orange, an orange more saturated, more vivid than any orange that could exist in the physical spectrum. Your brain, in trying to process both the real and the afterimage signals simultaneously, creates a color that exceeds the normal boundaries of perception. These experiments with impossible colors have revealed something profound about consciousness. Our experience of reality isn't a passive reception of what's out there. It's an active construction, a creative process that happens so automatically we never notice it. This has implications far beyond color vision. If our brains are creating colors that don't exist, what else might they be creating? Neuroscientist Anil Seth calls this the controlled hallucination of consciousness. We don't perceive the world directly. We predict it. Our brains construct a model of reality based on sensory input, prior experience, and unconscious inference. When that model is accurate enough for survival, we call it reality. When it's not, we call it hallucination. Magenta sits right at the boundary between these two states. It's not a hallucination because it corresponds to real stimuli, actual red and blue light entering our eyes, but it's not quite reality either, because the color itself exists nowhere but in our neural processing. It's a controlled creation, a necessary invention that helps us navigate a world where red and blue light can coexist. The discovery that magenta doesn't exist has even influenced technology. Computer screens and televisions create millions of colors using just 3 types of light: red, green, and blue. Every color you see on a screen, including magenta, is a mixture of these three. The engineers who designed these systems understood that they didn't need to reproduce every wavelength of light. They just needed to trigger the right pattern of cone responses in your eyes. This RGB color system is essentially a hack of human vision. It takes advantage of the fact that we don't see wavelengths directly, but rather the pattern of activation across our three cone types. By carefully mixing red, green, and blue light, screens can trigger almost any pattern of cone response, creating the perception of colors that aren't physically present. Printers use a different hack, mixing cyan, magenta, and yellow inks. Here, magenta plays a crucial role as one of the primary colors of subtractive color mixing. The magenta ink absorbs green light, while reflecting red and blue, creating that impossible color through the absence of green rather than the presence of any specific wavelength. The philosophy of magenta extends into questions about the nature of reality itself. If magenta doesn't exist, but we can all see it, agree on it, and use it consistently, in what sense is it not real? This echoes ancient philosophical debates about the nature of perception and reality, but with a modern neuroscientific twist. Some philosophers argue that magenta is perfectly real. It's just real as a perceptual phenomenon rather than a physical one. Others suggest that magenta reveals the fundamentally constructed nature of all perception. We don't see reality. We see our brain's interpretation of reality. And sometimes, as with magenta, that interpretation includes things that aren't there in any physical sense. The story of magenta also connects to broader questions about evolution and why we see the way we do. Our visual system didn't evolve to show us objective reality. It evolved to help us survive and reproduce. The ability to distinguish between different combinations of wavelengths, even if it means creating impossible colors, might have provided survival advantages to our ancestors. Consider flowers, many of which appear magenta to us. These flowers are often pollinated by birds or insects that can see ultraviolet light. To these creatures, the flowers might look completely different. But to us, with our limited vision, the combination of reflected red and blue light registers as magenta, a strong, distinctive color that helps us identify and remember these plants. This raises an interesting possibility. Magenta might exist precisely because it's useful. It's a way for our brains to represent information about the world that would otherwise be lost. When we see magenta, we're seeing that something is reflecting both long and short wavelengths but not medium ones, information that could be important for identifying objects, foods, or dangers in our environment. The implications of magenta's non-existence ripple outward into unexpected areas of science and human experience. Consider, for instance, the world of animals, many of whom see colors we can't even imagine. Mantis shrimp have 16 types of color receptors compared to our 3. They can see ultraviolet, visible, and even polarized light. The colors they perceive are as far beyond our imagination as magenta would be to a creature that could only see in black and white. What impossible colors might exist in their visual world? What gaps might their brains be filling with colors that exist nowhere in the electromagnetic spectrum? But here's a twist. Despite having 16 types of color receptors, mantis shrimp are actually quite poor at distinguishing between similar colors. They can't tell apart colors that seem obviously different to us. This paradox puzzled scientists until they realized that mantis shrimp don't process color the way we do. Instead of comparing signals from different receptors to create colors, each type of receptor in a mantis shrimp's eye seems to function more like a simple detector, scanning for specific wavelengths important to the shrimp's survival. This discovery revolutionized our understanding of color vision. It showed that having more types of color receptors doesn't necessarily mean seeing more colors. The magic isn't in the detection, it's in the processing. Our 3-cone system, combined with our brain's sophisticated processing, actually allows us to see millions of colors. The mantis shrimp's 16 receptor system, with simpler processing, might actually result in a less rich color experience. Birds, on the other hand, process colors more like we do, but with an extra dimension. Many birds have 4 types of color receptors, including one sensitive to ultraviolet light. This means they have their own version of impossible colors, combinations that can't exist in their extended spectrum. A bird might see ultra-green or violet red, colors that would be as impossible in their visual system as magenta is in ours. But you don't need to be a mantis shrimp or a bird to experience colors beyond normal perception. Some humans report seeing colors that shouldn't exist during various altered states of consciousness. Users of certain psychedelic substances often describe encountering colors that they can't name or describe, colors that seem impossible when they try to recall them in normal consciousness. These experiences raise profound questions about the nature of color and perception. Are these genuinely new colors? Or are drugs simply causing unusual patterns of neural activation that the brain interprets as impossible colors? Research using brain imaging suggests it might be both. Psychedelics seem to increase communication between brain regions that don't normally interact strongly, potentially creating novel patterns of visual processing that generate unprecedented color experiences. Even in ordinary consciousness, we occasionally glimpse impossible colors. Have you ever noticed that at twilight, just as the sun sets, the world can take on colors that seem otherworldly? There's a moment when the light is just right, and surfaces seem to glow with colors that don't quite fit into our usual categories. Photographers call this the magic hour. But perhaps what makes it magical is that we're seeing the world painted in impossible colors, colors that exist in the intersection of different light sources and atmospheric conditions. The phenomenon called the Purkinje effect demonstrates how our color perception shifts with lighting conditions. As light dims, our eyes become more sensitive to blue and green and less sensitive to red. This is why a red rose might look bright in daylight, but appears almost black at dusk, while blue flowers seem to glow in the twilight. During the transition, as our vision shifts from cone-based color to rod-based black and white, we might perceive colors that don't quite match any normal category, impossible twilight colors that exist only in that liminal space between day and night vision. The study of impossible colors has led to practical applications in treating vision problems. Some researchers are experimenting with using impossible color experiences to help people with color blindness distinguish between colors they normally can't differentiate. By training the brain to recognize the subtle differences in neural activation patterns, even when the cone signals are impaired, it might be possible to expand the range of perceived colors. There's a fascinating case study of a colorblind artist named Neil Harbison, who was born with achromatopsia, complete colorblindness. He sees the world only in grayscale, but Harbison now hears colors through a device he wears that converts light wavelengths into sound frequencies. After years of using this device, his brain has created a kind of synesthetic experience where he perceives colors as sounds. In a sense, his brain has created an entirely new way of experiencing impossible colors, colors that exist for him as auditory rather than visual experiences. This raises the intriguing possibility that impossible colors might not be limited to vision at all. If color is fundamentally a creation of the brain rather than a property of light, could we learn to experience colors through other senses? Could we create new impossible colors by combining sensory inputs in novel ways? Virtual reality researchers are already exploring this frontier. By manipulating the relationship between what we see and what our brain expects, VR can create color experiences that would be impossible in the real world. Imagine a virtual environment where moving your head changes not just your perspective but the actual colors of objects, or where certain impossible colors only appear when you're moving at specific speeds. These experiments are showing us that the boundaries of color perception are far more flexible than we ever imagined. The digital age has created new opportunities for impossible colors. Computer graphics can generate colors that can't exist in nature, colors with negative light, colors that change based on viewing angle in ways that violate physics, colors that exist in mathematical color spaces beyond human perception. Artists and designers are beginning to explore these impossible palettes, creating digital art that couldn't exist in any other medium. But perhaps the most profound exploration of impossible colors is happening in the field of consciousness research. Scientists studying the neural correlates of consciousness have discovered that color perception activates a surprisingly large network of brain regions, not just the visual cortex, but areas involved in memory, emotion, and even language. This suggests that color isn't just a visual phenomenon but a whole brain experience. The magenta you see isn't just created by your visual system. It's shaped by your memories of magenta things, your emotional associations with the color, even the words you use to describe it. In different cultures with different color vocabularies, magenta might be experienced differently, categorized differently, even seen differently. And so, here we are at the gentle end of our journey through the impossible. We've discovered that one of the most vivid colors in our world exists nowhere but in the space between neurons, in the creative interpretation of conflicting signals, in the gap that physics left but biology filled. Magenta, that electric presence that adorns flowers and sunsets, that dances at the edge of our vision in the twilight hours, is proof that our brains are not mere recording devices, but active artists, painting the world in colors that physics never imagined. Tomorrow, when you wake and go about your day, you'll see magenta everywhere, in the morning glories climbing a fence, in the neon signs that light up at dusk, in the clothes people wear and the art they create. And each time you see it, you might remember that you're witnessing a small miracle, your brain creating something from nothing, filling the world with impossible beauty. But magenta is just the beginning. Now that you know one color doesn't exist, you might start to wonder about all the others. That brown of your morning coffee, it's not in the spectrum either. The pink of a sunrise, the purple of a bruise, the countless shades that exist only in the interaction between light and consciousness, they're all in their own way impossible colors that we've agreed to see. This isn't a reason for existential worry. If anything, it's a cause for wonder. Your brain, that 3-pound universe inside your skull, is constantly performing acts of creation that you never notice. It's building a world for you, color by impossible color, filling in gaps with such skill that you'd never know anything was missing. Think about what this means for the bigger picture of human experience. If our brains can create colors that don't exist, what else might they be creating? Every perception, every memory, every moment of consciousness is, in a sense, a creative act. We're not passive observers of reality. We're active participants in its construction. This has profound implications for how we understand ourselves and others. The magenta I see might be subtly different from the magenta you see, shaped by our different visual systems, our different brains, our different experiences. We assume we're seeing the same colors, living in the same visual world, but each of us might be living in a slightly different version of reality, painted in our own unique palette of impossible colors. And perhaps that's the most beautiful thing about magenta. It reminds us that perception is creative, that consciousness is an act of imagination grounded in physics but not limited by it. We don't just observe reality, we participate in its creation, one impossible color at a time. The story of magenta also teaches us something about the nature of scientific discovery. For centuries, people saw magenta without questioning its existence. It took the combined insights of physics, biology, and neuroscience to reveal that this everyday color was actually impossible. How many other assumptions about reality might we be making? What other impossible things might be hiding in plain sight? As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you'll dream in impossible colors and super oranges and reddish greens, in the unnamed hues that exist in the spaces between waking and sleeping. Dreams, after all, are where our brains are free to create without the constraints of physics. In dreams, impossible colors are not just possible, but common. You might see colors that have no names, colors that shift and change in ways that would be impossible in waking life, colors that carry emotional or symbolic meaning beyond their visual properties. And maybe, just maybe, you'll wake with a new appreciation for the ordinary magic of seeing, for the extraordinary feat of consciousness that turns wavelengths into rainbows and creates beauty from the impossible. Consider this. Every piece of art ever created, every photograph ever taken, every sunset ever admired, all of these have been experienced through brains that create impossible colors. The history of human visual culture is, in a sense, a history of impossible colors. The magenta in a Renaissance painting, the pink in a Japanese cherry blossom print, the purple in a digital photograph. None of these exist in the physics of light, yet they've moved us, inspired us, become part of our collective visual heritage. This realization might change how you think about reality itself. If something as basic as color can be a creation of consciousness rather than a property of the physical world, what does that say about the nature of reality? Are we discovering the universe? Or are we creating it through our perception? Maybe it's both. Maybe reality is a collaboration between the physical world and consciousness, with impossible colors like magenta showing us exactly where that collaboration happens. The next time you see magenta, and you will, probably within minutes of finishing this video, take a moment to appreciate what you're really seeing. You're not just seeing a color, you're seeing your brain's creative solution to an impossible problem. You're seeing the intersection of physics and neuroscience, of light and consciousness. You're seeing proof that your brain is not just a passive receiver, but an active creator of your experienced reality. And in that moment of recognition, you might feel a little spark of wonder. Wonder at the complexity hidden in the simplest experiences. Wonder at the creativity of evolution, which built brains capable of seeing colors that don't exist. Wonder at the universe, which somehow produced conscious beings capable of creating beauty from impossibility. Thank you for joining me on this gentle exploration of the color that doesn't exist. I hope it's helped you see the world a little differently, or at least given your mind something softly fascinating to ponder as you drift toward sleep. If you enjoyed this journey into the impossible, you might like to subscribe for more quiet explorations of the universe's peculiar corners. Next time, we might explore why time moves differently when you're bored, or how your brain decides what to forget, or why the moon looks bigger on the horizon than high in the sky. All those gentle mysteries that surround us every day, waiting to be noticed. Until then, sleep well, dream in impossible colors, and remember, just because something doesn't exist doesn't mean it isn't real. Sometimes the most beautiful things are the ones we create together, wavelength by missing wavelength, in the glorious gap between physics and perception. As you close your eyes tonight, let the impossible colors fade into dreams. Let magenta be your reminder that reality is more flexible, more creative, more wonderful than we usually imagine. And let the knowledge that your brain is constantly creating the impossible fill you not with doubt, but with a deep, peaceful appreciation for the magnificent complexity of being human. Let C dive deeper into what's actually happening in your brain when you see magenta. The story begins in the retina, that paper-thin layer of tissue at the back of your eye that's more complex than most computers. Your retina contains about 120 million rod cells for low-light vision and 6 million cone cells for color vision. But here's the fascinating part. These 126 million light detectors have to compress their information down to only 1 million nerve fibers in the optic nerve. That's a compression ratio of 126 to 1. Your eye is performing massive data compression before the signal even reaches your brain. This compression is where the magic begins. Your retina doesn't just pass along raw data about wavelengths. It performs sophisticated pre-processing, looking for patterns, edges, contrasts, and relationships. Special cells called horizontal cells and amacrine cells create lateral connections across the retina. When certain cones detect red light and others detect blue light, but the green cones remain quiet, these pre-processing circuits flag this as a special condition, a condition that will eventually become magenta in your consciousness. The signal then travels through the optic nerve to the lateral geniculate nucleus, LGN, in the thalamus, a sort of relay station deep in your brain. The LGN has 6 distinct layers, each processing different aspects of the visual signal. Some layers handle color, others deal with brightness, motion, or fine detail. It's here that the opponent process hearing discovered actually takes place. Certain neurons in the LGN fire when they receive more red than green signal. Others fire for green over red. Still others compare blue with yellow, which is itself a combination of red and green signals. When your LGN receives strong red and strong blue signals but little green, it generates a unique pattern of activity, a neural signature that represents this impossible combination. This pattern is consistent and reproducible. Every time you see magenta, roughly the same neurons fire in roughly the same way. It's as reliable as any other color experience, which is why magenta feels just as real as blue or green. From the LGN, the signal travels to the primary visual cortex, also known as V1, located at the very back of your brain. V1 contains about 140 million neurons, arranged in a complex architecture of columns and layers. Each neuron in V1 responds to specific features, some to vertical lines, others to horizontal lines, some to specific colors, others to motion in particular directions. It's like having millions of specialized detectors, each looking for one very specific thing. But V1 is just the beginning. From there, visual information spreads out through at least 30 different brain areas, each analyzing different aspects of what you're seeing. Area V4 specializes in color processing, containing neurons that respond to specific hues regardless of the wavelength composition. This is where magenta truly becomes magenta, not just a pattern of cone activation, but a perceived color with all its qualities of hue, saturation, and brightness. What's remarkable is that V4 neurons don't care how you create magenta, whether it's from mixing red and blue light, from looking at magenta ink which absorbs green and reflects everything else, or from an afterimage. The same V4 neurons fire. They're responding to the subjective experience of magenta, not to any physical property of light. In a very real sense, these neurons are the physical instantiation of an impossible color. The story gets even stranger when we consider top-down processing. Your brain doesn't just process visual information from the bottom up, starting with photons and building up to perception. It also works from the top down, using expectations, memories, and context to shape what you see. Higher brain areas send signals back down to V4, V1, and even the LGN, modulating their activity based on what the brain expects to see. This means that your perception of magenta is influenced not just by the light entering your eyes, but by your memories of magenta things, your expectations about what color something should be, even the word magenta itself. Studies have shown that people who speak languages with different color categories actually see colors differently. Russian speakers, who have separate words for light blue goluboy and dark blue simi, are faster at distinguishing between these shades than English speakers who call both blue. The existence of magenta raises profound philosophical questions that have puzzled thinkers for centuries. If magenta doesn't exist in the physical world but we all see it, what does this tell us about the nature of reality and consciousness? This question touches on what philosophers call the hard problem of consciousness. How and why do we have subjective experiences? When you see magenta, there's something it's like to see magenta. It has a quality, what philosophers call qualia, that seems to go beyond mere information processing. A computer could detect the wavelengths that trigger magenta perception, but would it experience magenta the way you do? The philosopher Frank Jackson proposed a famous thought experiment called Mary's Room that directly relates to our impossible color. Mary is a brilliant scientist who knows everything there is to know about the physics and neuroscience of color vision, but she's been raised in a black and white environment and has never seen color. When Mary finally steps out and sees a red tomato for the first time, does she learn something new? Most people intuitively say yes. She learns what red looks like, something all her scientific knowledge couldn't teach her. Now imagine a variation. Mary knows that magenta doesn't exist as a wavelength. She understands exactly how the brain creates it from red and blue signals. She can predict precisely which neurons will fire when someone sees magenta. But when she finally sees magenta for the first time, she still experiences something new, the qualitative experience of magenta, the what it's like, that no amount of scientific knowledge could convey. This suggests that consciousness involves more than just information processing. There's something about the subjective experience of magenta that transcends its physical and neural basis. Some philosophers argue this proves consciousness is fundamentally non-physical. Others maintain that it simply shows our current scientific understanding is incomplete. The philosopher Daniel Dennett takes a different approach, arguing that qualia don't exist in the way we think they do. According to Dennett, the experience of magenta is nothing more than the brain's disposition to react in certain ways, to say that's magenta, to have certain associations and memories triggered, to be able to discriminate it from other colors. There's no additional feeling of magenta beyond these functional properties. The impossible color is impossible all the way down. It doesn't exist physically, and it doesn't exist as a special conscious property either. It's just a useful fiction our brains create. But this deflationary view struggles to explain why magenta seems so vividly real. When you look at a magenta flower, you're not just disposed to say that's magenta, you're having a rich, vivid experience that seems to have a particular character. The magenta-ness of magenta feels like something more than just a behavioral disposition or a computational state. The phenomenologist, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, offers yet another perspective. He argued that perception is always embodied. We don't just have abstract experiences of color, but rather we perceive colors through our bodies, in relation to our environment and our possibilities for action. Magenta isn't just a color, it's a way of being in the world, a particular mode of engagement with our environment. The impossibility of magenta doesn't make it less real, it makes it a perfect example of how perception is creative, how consciousness doesn't just receive the world, but actively constitutes it. This phenomenological view aligns surprisingly well with recent neuroscience. We now know that color perception involves not just visual areas but also regions associated with emotion, memory, and action planning. When you see magenta, your entire brain participates in creating that experience. It's not just a visual phenomenon but a whole body, whole brain event. Cultural colors and impossible linguistics. 2,000 words. The story of magenta becomes even more complex when we consider how different cultures perceive and categorize colors. The way we think about magenta, as a distinct color deserving its own name, is far from universal. Some languages don't have a word for magenta at all. Others group it with red or purple, or have multiple words for different shades of what we call magenta. The Himba people of Namibia have only 5 color terms in their language. What we call magenta might be grouped with reds and purples under their term sarandu. But this doesn't mean they can't see magenta. When tested, they can discriminate it from other colors just as well as English speakers. However, they're faster at distinguishing between subtle shades of green that have different names in their language but not in ours. This suggests that language shapes color perception in subtle but measurable ways. The impossible color of magenta might be more or less impossible depending on your linguistic background. If your language treats magenta as a fundamental color category, you might perceive it more vividly and remember it more accurately than someone whose language groups it with other colors. Japanese has an interesting relationship with magenta-like colors. The word murasaki traditionally referred to purple, but modern Japanese has borrowed magenta from English, particularly for describing printing colors. This linguistic borrowing reflects how technology, in this case, color printing, can introduce new color concepts that require new words. Ancient Greek is famous for its puzzling color terminology. Homer described the sea as wine dark and honey as green. Some scholars argued this meant the ancient Greeks were colorblind, but more likely they simply categorized colors differently, perhaps based on brightness or texture rather than hue. They might have seen magenta, but classified it in ways we wouldn't recognize. The invention of new pigments and dyes has historically led to new color terms and categories. Magenta itself got its name from the Battle of Magenta in 1859, shortly after the synthetic dye was invented. Before this, the color existed in nature, in certain flowers and sunsets, but it didn't have a distinct name in many languages. The creation of a reliable way to produce the color led to its recognition as a distinct category. This raises fascinating questions about impossible colors we haven't yet named or noticed. Are there combinations of neural activity that could produce color experiences we haven't yet categorized? As we develop new technologies, new types of displays, new ways of manipulating light, might we discover new impossible colors? Some artists and designers are already exploring this frontier. Digital artist Rafael Lozano Hemmer creates installations that use biometric data to generate colors that shift and change in ways impossible with traditional pigments. The colors you see depend on your heartbeat, your skin conductance, your breathing, creating a personalized palette of impossible colors unique to each viewer. The Pantone color system, used by designers worldwide, includes many colors that don't exist as single wavelengths. Their color of the year often features impossible colors, complex hues that can only be created through mixing. In 2014, it was Radiant Orchid, a purple pink that's close to magenta. In 2018, Ultraviolet was chosen, another impossible color that exists only in our perception. The discovery that magenta doesn't exist has profoundly influenced how we create and display colors in technology. Every screen you look at, every digital photo you take, every color printer you use, they all exploit the impossible nature of color perception to create their effects. Computer monitors use additive color mixing with red, green, and blue (RGB) subpixels to create magenta. They simply turn on the red and blue subpixels while leaving green off. Your brain does the rest, creating the perception of a color that isn't actually there. The monitor isn't producing magenta light. It's producing red light and blue light in close proximity, and your visual system blends them into magenta. This RGB system is based directly on the trichromatic theory of vision. Engineers realized they didn't need to reproduce every possible wavelength of light. They just needed to stimulate the 3 types of cones in the right proportions. With just 3 colors, they can create about 16.7 million different combinations, far more than the human eye can distinguish. But here's where it gets interesting. Different display technologies create magenta in different ways, and these differences can be perceived. An OLED display, which uses organic compounds that emit light, produces very pure red and blue that combine into a particularly vivid magenta. An LCD display, which filters white backlight through colored filters, creates a different version of magenta. A quantum dot display, using nanocrystals that emit specific wavelengths when excited, produces yet another variant. Professional photographers and designers obsess over these differences. They use color calibration tools to ensure that the magenta they see on their screen matches the magenta that will be printed or displayed elsewhere. But perfect matching is impossible, because different devices create impossible colors in fundamentally different ways. Printing technology faces an even more complex challenge. While screens use additive color, adding light to create colors, printing uses subtractive color, removing wavelengths from white light. The primary colors for printing are cyan, magenta, and yellow (CMY), often with black added for deeper shadows, hence CMYK. Magenta ink is particularly crucial in printing because it absorbs green light while reflecting red and blue. Without magenta ink, it would be impossible to print a wide range of purples, pinks, and reds. The magenta in CMYK printing is itself an impossible color, created not by producing specific wavelengths, but by absorbing others. The history of magenta in printing is fascinating. Before synthetic magenta dyes were developed in the 1850s, achieving this color in print was extremely difficult and expensive. Natural sources like cochineal insects or certain mollusks were used, but these produced colors that were more red or purple than true magenta. The synthesis of magenta dye, originally called fuchsine, revolutionized color printing and fashion. Modern printing technology has pushed the boundaries even further. Hexachrome printing adds orange and green to CMYK, expanding the range of printable colors. Some high-end printers use 8, 10, or even 12 different inks, including multiple shades of magenta, to achieve more accurate color reproduction. Each additional ink allows for new impossible colors, combinations that exist nowhere in the spectrum, but everywhere in our perception. Virtual and augmented reality technologies are opening entirely new frontiers for impossible colors. These systems can control exactly what each eye sees, potentially creating colors that are impossible even by the standards of impossible colors. Imagine a color that appears magenta to your left eye and cyan to your right eye. What would your brain make of that? Some VR researchers are experimenting with these binocular rivalry colors, creating experiences that have no equivalent in natural vision. As we stand on the brink of new technologies and deeper understanding of consciousness, what might the future hold for impossible colors like magenta? The possibilities are as boundless as they are fascinating. Neurotechnology is advancing rapidly, with brain-computer interfaces becoming increasingly sophisticated. In the future, we might be able to directly stimulate the neurons in V4 that respond to magenta, creating the experience of the color without any light entering the eyes at all. This could allow blind people to experience colors, including impossible ones, for the first time. Some researchers are exploring whether we could create entirely new color experiences by stimulating combinations of neurons that never naturally fire together. Could we create a super magenta that's even more impossible than regular magenta? Could we invent colors that no human has ever seen? Colors that don't just lack wavelengths, but lack any natural neural correlate. Genetic engineering presents another intriguing possibility. Scientists have already created mice with human color vision genes, allowing them to see colors they couldn't naturally perceive. In the future, could we engineer humans with 4, 5, or even more types of color receptors? Would these enhanced humans see new impossible colors in the gaps between their extended spectrum? There's already a proof of concept for this. Some women are natural tetrachromats with 4 types of color receptors. Researchers are studying these individuals to understand what their color experience might be like. Artist Conchetta Antico, who may be a tetrachromat, describes seeing colors in shadows that others perceive as gray, and multiple distinct hues where others see a single color. For her, our impossible magenta might be several different colors, each impossible in its own way. Climate change and environmental degradation might change the colors we see in nature. As the chemistry of the atmosphere changes, the way light scatters could shift, creating new twilight colors, new variations in the sky that our brains would have to interpret. Evolution is slow, but cultural evolution is fast. We might develop new categories and names for colors that don't yet exist in our experience. Artificial intelligence is also pushing the boundaries of color perception. Machine learning algorithms trained on millions of images are discovering patterns in color use that humans haven't consciously recognized. Some AI systems have identified optimal color combinations for specific emotional effects, including heavy use of impossible colors like magenta. As AI becomes more involved in design and art, we might see new impossible colors emerge from the intersection of human perception and machine creativity. The field of quantum optics is revealing new ways that light can behave, which might lead to new types of impossible colors. Quantum entanglement, where particles remain connected across vast distances, could theoretically be used to create colors that are correlated in impossible ways. Imagine a magenta that's quantum entangled with a green. When you see one, someone else, somewhere else, sees the other. It sounds like science fiction, but quantum technologies are advancing rapidly. Space exploration might expose us to new color experiences. Other planets have different atmospheres that filter light in unique ways. The butterscotch sky of Mars, the deep blue of Neptune, the swirling browns and reds of Jupiter. These alien color palettes might require new impossible colors to fully describe. As humans spend more time in space or on other worlds, we might develop new color categories adapted to these environments. There's even speculation about parallel universes with different physical laws, where light behaves differently and colors we can't imagine might be commonplace. While this remains highly speculative, some physicists seriously consider the possibility of alternate realities with different spectrums of electromagnetic radiation. In such universes, magenta might be a real wavelength, while colors we consider normal might be impossible. Let me share something personal about impossible colors. As you've been reading this, You've probably been seeing magenta in your mind's eye, imagining it, remembering it, perhaps even seeing after images of it if you've been looking at examples. This mental magenta is even more impossible than the regular kind. It exists without any light at all, created entirely by your memory and imagination. Think about your earliest memory of magenta. Perhaps it was a crayon in a box, labeled with that exotic word that sounded nothing like red or blue or green. Maybe it was a flower in a garden or a sunset that painted the sky in impossible colors. That first encounter with magenta was your introduction to the impossible, though you didn't know it at the time. Children seem particularly drawn to magenta and other impossible colors. Visit any toy store, and you'll see aisles dominated by hot pink and electric purple, colors that don't exist in the spectrum, but seem to exist very powerfully in children's preferences. Some developmental psychologists suggest this might be because children's visual systems are still developing, making them more sensitive to the dramatic neural signatures of impossible colors. As we age, our perception of magenta and other colors can change. The lens of the eye gradually yellows, filtering out some blue light. This means that the magenta an elderly person sees might be shifted toward red compared to what they saw in youth. Yet the brain often compensates for these changes, maintaining color constancy across a lifetime. Your internal model of magenta adapts and adjusts, keeping the impossible color consistent even as the physical apparatus of seeing changes. People who work extensively with color, artists, designers, printers, often report that their perception of magenta and other colors becomes more refined over time. They can distinguish between subtly different magentas that look identical to untrained eyes. This isn't just about having better color vocabulary. Studies show that their brains actually process color differently, with stronger and more distinct neural responses to small color differences. Synesthetes, people who experience cross-connections between different senses, might have the most unusual relationships with impossible colors. Some synesthetes see letters or numbers in specific colors, and often these colors are impossible ones like magenta. The letter A might always appear magenta to them, not because of any property of the letter, but because their brains have created this arbitrary but consistent association. For these individuals, magenta might be impossible in multiple ways, a color that doesn't exist in physics, experienced in relation to shapes that have no inherent color. Memory plays a crucial role in how we experience magenta. When you remember a magenta dress or a magenta flower, your brain reactivates many of the same neurons that fired when you originally saw it. But memory is reconstructive, not reproductive. Each time you remember magenta, you're creating it anew, potentially shifting and changing it in subtle ways. The magenta you remember might be more vivid, more saturated, more impossible than the magenta you actually saw. Dreams offer another window into personal experiences of impossible colors. Many people report dreaming in colors that don't exist in waking life. Supersaturated hues, colors that shift and change, colors that seem to have emotional or symbolic properties beyond their visual appearance. Dream researchers have found that people who work with color during the day are more likely to have vivid color dreams, including dreams featuring impossible colors like magenta. Meditation and altered states of consciousness can also affect how we perceive impossible colors. Some meditators report that during deep states, colors become more vivid and distinct, with impossible colors like magenta taking on an almost luminous quality. This might be due to changes in attention and neural processing during meditation, allowing for a more direct experience of the brain's color-creating mechanisms. Good night, and sweet dreams in all the colors that shouldn't exist but do.